You're listening to the unSILOed podcast with Greg LeBlanc, produced by University FM. unSILOed is a series of interdisciplinary conversations that inspire new ways of thinking about our world. So wherever you are, enjoy today's episode, and here's your host, Greg LeBlanc.
Welcome to unSILOed. This is Greg LeBlanc. I'm here today with Frank Furedi, who is an emeritus professor at the University of Kent, also director of a think tank called MCC Brussels, but is probably better known as a cultural critic and the author of numerous books, some of which I have here. I think the latest book, well, it's hard to keep track. I don't know. There's like 30 books or so. Is that right? 30?
28. Yeah.
28. Okay. The latest book is called The War Against the Past, Why the West Must Fight for Its History. And then, I'm not sure if this is the one before that, but it's called How Fear Works, Culture of Fear in the 21st Century, which is a follow-up to an earlier book on the culture of fear. You've got one called The Power of Reading, From Socrates to Twitter. This one goes way back. Where Have All the Intellectuals Gone? Confronting 21st Century Philistinism. There's this one called The Road to Ukraine, relatively short one. Why Borders Matter, Therapy Culture, Paranoid Parents, and What's Happened to the University. Welcome, Frank.
Nice to talk to you.
Well, look, I think if we were going to try and find a recurring theme throughout all of your work at the highest level, I would say it's probably to do with the decline of maybe what we might call phronesis or practical wisdom. Because I do believe that all of these are effectively about how our culture has changed in many ways, many for the worse, and that a lot of this cultural transformation happens during education. At the earliest stages, education going back to childhood even. And so that book, remember, Paranoid Parents, I think it might seem like it's a little bit out of sync with the rest of the books. I think it's actually integral because you're interested in cultural formation and how cultural values and beliefs are transmitted. So maybe we could start with the most recent book, The War Against the Past, which to me, it looks like it emerged out of the last chapter of How Fear Works. And maybe talk a bit about what you mean by the war against the past. I mean, is this simply presentism or is there something more to it?
Well, I think there is a very real problem in the sense that in the contemporary world, we find it very difficult to know how to relate to our intellectual legacy. And in particular, how we can make it work for us in our own world. And one of the things that has occurred is there's been an attempt to detach ourselves from the past. I think American culture in particular basically looks down upon anything that is outdated, anything that is remotely old is seen as being not just sort of old, but also as morally and intellectually inferior. So when we think about 19th century people, we don't just simply say that we don't know that they knew less than we do, which is right. But what we also say is that they weren't as good at people as we are. And there's a kind of self-flattery about the present moment, which basically means that in terms of philosophy or in terms of basic intellectual ideals, there's a kind of tendency to cut ourselves off and become trapped in the moment and become trapped in the present, which is why in this book, I talk about the way in which the old classical temporal distinctions between the past, present, and the future have unraveled to some extent because we want to push the past away. And if you push the past away too much, you end up being stuck in the present because without the guidance of the past, it's very difficult to know how to move towards the future, how to basically have an orientation towards what lies ahead within society.
Well, look, how is that different from just like a Whig view of history, or even going back to the Renaissance, where they wanted to contrast themselves with their recent past, which is called the Dark Ages?
Yeah, I think that at every age there are attempts to position yourself and your society in different kind of ways, depending on the circumstances. But I think if you look at the Renaissance, even though they would want to, in a sense, as you say, make a moral contrast between themselves and the immediate sort of ancestors that were there, nevertheless, the Renaissance is really about rebirth. And there's a very strong sense in which what they want to do is they want to reappropriate the best that existed beforehand. And in the course of reappropriating it, what they want to do is to make it come alive within their own lifetime. And I think that's a really positive way of dealing with the past. I love the Renaissance precisely because what they're doing is they're working on the past in a kind of creative kind of a way. And in the course of doing that, they create a very unique cultural moment, a very special cultural moment in terms of the history of both the world and the Western civilization. I think what is different about today is we basically argue that the past is by definition toxic. Not only is it inferior to us, but its influence, the influence of the past on the present, is something we need to be wary of, need to kind of create a quarantine around our world just to make sure that these influences do not have an impact upon particularly young people, but also the rest of society. And in the book, I talk about year zero ideology, by which I mean very simply that everything that is good and is worthwhile and everything that we should appreciate begins year zero, which tends to be after Second World War in 1945. And everything beforehand is just basically toxic. It's got a very negative influence upon our lives.
Now, of course, when we think year zero, we think French Revolution, we think Pol Pot. Those are a little bit more nefarious than, say, the birth of the EU. What's wrong with trying to put Nazism behind us, put World War I behind us, put all that terrible stuff behind us? Isn't that just a form of optimism and a form of looking forward by stressing the bad old days?
I think on the contrary, I think it's a kind of fatalism where you basically have this, what I call a teleology of evil, where you basically argue that everything that has gone on beforehand sort of inexorably leads to Auschwitz. Everything that has happened in the previous 2,000 years has got this negative kind of consequence. And you have this very silly history where, for example, people say Martin Luther, who isn't a hero of mine, but nevertheless played an important role in the Reformation, was the antecedent of Adolf Hitler, that already in his authoritarian behavior, there were the seeds of what would happen in the 1930s and 1940s. And that kind of simplistic history means that you do not even actually understand what is unique and special about the Holocaust, what is the tragedy that befell upon us, if you see that merely as more of the same. Because then you forget about the Enlightenment, you forget about the incredible achievements of German culture, someone like Heine, Beethoven, and some of the artistic sort of endeavors that existed there, and impoverish our own sensibility through doing something like that. And I think a mature individual learns to be critical of the horrible things that have occurred in the past, whilst at the same time learns to valorize and affirm what were very positive contributions to human civilization.
Well, look, you quoted Cicero, who said history is life's teacher. But aren't these folks that you're discussing in the book, aren't they using the past as textbook? Aren't they using it as a collection of stories that are designed to provide instruction and lessons to the present as to all the things you shouldn't do and so forth?
I suppose you could argue that they have a negative view of lessons, but basically the way that I look at it is that instead of learning from the past, they tend to sort of remake the past in their own image. Because one of the things I write about in the book is that, of course, you cannot leave the past behind. That's inconceivable. And therefore, what you end up doing is you, on the one hand, become obsessed about leaving the past behind. But at the same time, you also want to almost relive yourselves through the past. So we have a situation where every group in society will want to validate themselves to discovering their antecedents. So you have a bizarre situation where it's suggested that trans culture began in ancient Egypt. And for that reason, it's not valid or legitimate for archaeologists, when they find a body in a particular sort of archaeological site in Egypt, to call that body that remained either that of a man or a woman, because we don't know how they would have identified. And what we do is we kind of read history backwards and use our present-day sensibilities in a very uncritical way, not really paying attention to the uniqueness of Egyptian civilization. So the temporal distinction paradoxically breaks down between the present and the past, because a lot of people feel more comfortable about fixing the problems of the past than we're dealing with the problems of today.
I mean, those seem like very different things. One is to say that the people in the past are irredeemably different from us and bad and inferior and evil. And the other one is to go back and say, oh, look, they're just like us. They had trans culture and so forth. Those seem inconsistent.
They do, which is why I talk about, I use the term the paradox of the past. because there is a complete inconsistency in writing off the past and at the same time pointing to Joan of Arc and saying that she probably was a trans woman because she behaved like a man. And so you have both the desire to appropriate bits of the past by rewriting it and validating your identity in the here and now, whilst at the same time arguing that the reason why there's a problem in people recognizing trans culture was because it was ignored in the past. So people didn't acknowledge that Joan of Arc was a trans woman or a trans man, or we didn't acknowledge that Cleopatra was actually sort of had non-binary fluid sexuality. We almost invent this kind of cartoonish kind of past where that kind of, in a sense, echoes who we are in some shape or form. So that is the paradox that I find quite curious, because there is a long history of people trying to validate that identity through the past. That's nothing new. But it's when you have this combination of a quest for validation through the rewriting of history alongside the writing off of the legacy of history. That kind of combination is what is special to our time.
Well, look, you cite the work of David Lowenthal, my former colleague here at Berkeley. He wrote this book, The Past is a Foreign Country. And to understand a foreign country, you have to put yourself in their shoes. You have to have the capacity to look at the world from a different perspective. And so there are some similarities between trying to understand people from another era and trying to understand people from a different culture. And elsewhere in your work, you talk about how truth has been replaced by truths. And with the rise of relativism, one would think that with the rise of relativism, this would actually make us more likely and more willing to be able to look at the world from different points of view, different perspectives, including those of the past.
I think that when cultural relativism emerged initially at the turn of the 20th century, there was a degree of sensitivity to the unique characteristics of different kind of people. And therefore, I really enjoy reading some of both the anthropological accounts that were written at that time, as well as the historical ones. And even though I didn't share their epistemological assumption, nevertheless, I think they were valuable pieces of work. I think the kind of relativism we have now is much more emptied of that kind of intellectual openness, that kind of quest to kind of find out what's really going on. Because a lot of the rewriting of history now, from a relativist point of view, already knows what it's going to discover. They already know what they're going to find. And that a priori orientation towards the past, where you basically, I call it grievance archaeology, where you're trying to dig up these nuggets of truths that you know are already there, is very different than some of the late 19th, early 20th century cultural relativist sort of contributions.
Well, you talk about the different phases of the war against the past, starting with the past is not relevant to the past is in clear and present danger. And so we need to kind of get rid of all evidence of the past. And again, the French revolutionaries wanted to change the names of everything. And we're doing that to some degree right now. It doesn't seem like there's anything wrong with pointing out that the statues of all of our heroes, I mean, most of these heroes were killers, right? And did some terrible stuff. What's the difference between, say, pointing that out and being, say, traumatized by it and requiring that we kind of get rid of these statues?
Well, you raise a number of different points. The first point is the French revolutionaries may well have wanted to get rid of the past, but as Marx said, they basically dressed up in the clothes of the Roman culture. They had a very strong sense of history. And even though they wanted to break from everything that has gone on, they could not help but have this kind of strong historical imagination, which is really, really lacking. There is nothing wrong with basically saying that the statue of this individual should be looked at critically because this individual did some horrible things, or at least his role within society was ambivalent. You know, he did some good things and bad things. I think most people have statues after them, aren't sort of totally evil. They made a contribution in their own way at that particular time. So it's useful to have a balanced assessment of what's going on. But what I think there is a very real problem, and this is new because I think people objected to statues beforehand, is the way in which therapeutic imagination has kind of kicked in. So basically, if you have people who argue that they're traumatized by a statue or They cannot sleep. They feel stressed out because there's this painting there in their university. Then I think what has happened is we basically cultivated a very diminished kind of subjectivity, where essentially we've basically educated people, particularly in higher education, to regard themselves more like patients rather than citizens. And therefore, not only do they become offended by the slightest criticism, but they basically use that rhetoric of offense in a way that, in a sense, inflates the herd. There's a kind of commitment to elevating that herd as much as possible, because that's the way you make the argument. That's the way you win an argument, by just pointing out just how much trauma you've experienced as a result of seeing a particular historical object.
Yeah. Now, look, you're not the only person that has written about the rise of fear and anxiety and the kind of fear factory or the anxiety industrial complex. What accounts for emphasis on safety as a value that we should focus on? Where does this come from?
Well, there's always been an emphasis on security. You go back to Thomas Hobbes, you already find that making people feel secure and using that as a way of demanding authority was something that was deeply entrenched. But it was never like a dominant value in the way that it has become. It was the foundational value that it has become in the 21st century Anglo-American world. And I think there are two reasons as to why this has occurred. I think the first reason has got to do with the unraveling of traditional or classical moral norms. And that also includes liberal moral norms, conservative moral norms. All these things have lost their salience, or much of their salience, in the 21st century. And therefore, what we have is a situation where the way that people try to deal with what I call the crisis of normativity is by writing mission statements, by writing these various lists. Our university has got, these are our 10 values. They're kind of invented through the help of consultants. And safety has become this kind of almost like a spontaneously sort of dominant value, for the very simple reason that alongside of the crisis of normativity, you also have what I call a crisis of subjectivity, where we have what I call a diminished sense of subjectivity, where agency, human agency, is itself devalued, is seen as being kind of arrogance, an impossible sort of arrogant way of behaving, rather than understanding that in the human condition is such that we cannot expect people to grow up as fast as previously, to read as many books as they might have done in the past, to be stretched by examinations without having a crisis or an exam syndrome in the way that it was the case in the past. In other words, we expect much less of people as they kind of growing up. So naturally, under those circumstances, they feel a little bit more fragile, a little bit less in control. Indeed, the very idea of control often has a very negative connotation in many circles in contemporary culture. We have expressions like control freaks and various other kind of terms that implies that the desire for control has got some very negative qualities to it. So when you have this kind of combination of fragile agency alongside the crisis of values, safety becomes this kind of terrain in which all these problems appear to be resolved.
So this is like defining danger downwards. I remember I had students during the pandemic and during the George Floyd who said, I can't focus, I can't study, I can't take exams, I need to be let out of class. And right across the street is Memorial Stadium, and we've got all the names of all the dead people from World War I. It seemed like, hey, we never canceled exams during World War I or during World War II, and we're going to cancel exams now. But I think that people would say, no, it's not that people are more fragile now. They were just as fragile back then, but that we somehow papered it over. We somehow just camouflaged it or denied it.
So basically, this is the dominant narrative, that we weren't aware that there were millions of trans people in the 14th century. We just papered that over and denied that reality. We weren't aware of the fact that LGBTQ culture was flourishing in Reims or in Paris. We kind of pretended it didn't exist. We didn't take into account the fact that people were traumatized by wars, and we kind of papered that over. And I think that what has happened is that we basically argue that we are just like people in the past, except that, and the expression that they use in the United States is the expression I hate more than any other expression. What they say is we're more aware. We are more aware than these idiots were 100 years ago. And that becomes the key that opens all the doors to our culture and it seems to me that there's a fundamental dishonesty about this, because what we've done is we kind of flattering ourselves that somehow by rediscovering ourselves in every single situations, no matter what, it seems to me that there is a difference. And certainly someone like my age can see that difference. I always tell the story that when I started teaching in university, I got a job as a professor, as a junior professor in 1974. And my MA students were expected to write, on balance, about 10 to 12 essays a term. That was the norm. 20 years later, we were told that that's too much, and we should really lower that down to 8 essays per term. And a lot of complaints came from students that 8 essays is too much. How could you? And eventually, decade by decade, the numbers of essays that had to be written changed. So now, in my university, when I left, we were down to 4 a term. And what's really funny was that even though the students only had to write 4 essays a term, they were still complaining that's too much. They were still late with the essays. They were still demanding extra time. And what has changed is the expectations that we have of ourselves, rather than the fact that somehow the students that were writing 12 essays a while back were traumatized or were somehow hurt or pained by what was expected of them.
Well, and I think one of the points that you're making is that these low expectations or this infantilization of people it's a new form of elitism. It's dismissing the potentiality of people and saying that they don't have what it takes, I guess, to be a contributing member of society. Is this a new type of anti-democratic elitism?
It is. I mean, because basically what you're suggesting is that people lack the intellectual and moral resources to think for themselves. They lack these intellectual moral resources to be independent and being able to make decisions about their lives without there being an army of counselors and mentors to show them the way. We have a situation where the way we regard people used to be called part of the demos, is one where we think they cannot deal with complexity. They cannot deal with nuance. They cannot deal with anything that is remotely requiring an intellectual problem-solving orientation. And we forget the fact that at the end of the day, that within human beings, there is an incredible capacity. I see this with young people, that when you raise the bar, when you expect a lot more from them than is the norm, they don't freak out and they don't have sort of mental health problems, but they often tend to rise to the occasion. And that's the way it's always been, which is why we have such a big difference between some institutions of education, schools particularly, where people are stretched rather than flattered and played with. So I do think that there's a tremendous problem here, because political problem for democracy, because if we're basically treating people in that kind of infantilized sense, then they do become less able to take advantage of all the things that democratic decision making offers us.
Well, one of the points you make in how fear works is that fear always has a moral valence. We tend to view fear through a psychological lens, but I think you point out that fear has always involved kind of good and evil. If we think about even the fairy tales, the thing that you are supposed to be afraid of is something bad. So if we are going to have a culture of fear, then what we're doing is expanding our enemies list to some extent.
That's right. So there's nothing wrong with fear. It's a normal emotion, and it has a very important role in regulating our society and the cultivating of certain moral norms. The problem becomes when we basically inflate the number of threats that are around, where everything becomes threatening, to the point at which, when I buy a book now, a Virginia Woolf novel, and I open it up and there's a trigger warning there, telling me that the language that Virginia Woolf uses might, sort of is not like what we're used to, or in some shape or form might be offensive. Then what we've done is we kind of expanded the range of threats to the point at which it acquires almost like a grotesquely caricatured form. And I think it's the inflation of threats, which then leads to a situation where we kind of talk about fear, not in a very kind of focused way, but very promiscuously. And that kind of sense of it's almost like you got to say, I really fear something, as a way of demonstrating that you're with it, you're respectable, you understand the way that the world works. And therefore, fear becomes something, the whole culture of fear that I discuss acquires a very different form than it would have done in a different era. It's a different cultural and social context, which we need to understand. And that's something I try to explore a little bit.
And I think you argue this starts relatively early in life. Young people are socialized to feel fear and anxiety.
Yes, and I think it's interesting that, it's something that I've noticed as a father, for example. When my 7-year-old son comes back from school and says to me, "Oh, Dad, I'm really stressed out. I'm really traumatized." And he uses kind of psychological language. It sounds like a little Freud. Then that, he didn't pick up this language in the playground. He picked up that language in school because that's the language that the teachers were using. And therefore, when children begin to talk in this psychological way, using that kind of vocabulary, then after a while, they begin to internalize that. And although they don't yet know what trauma is, or what depression is, or what being stressed out is, after a while, it becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's almost like it becomes normalized that you have some kind of mental health deficit. And then you have to basically intervene and do stuff to prevent them from anxiety, insulate them from certain kinds of fears. And that kind of orientation towards the socialization of young people obviously has this kind of cumulative effect, so that adults too begin to become afflicted by some of these kinds of conditions.
Now, of course, people like myself think that we can remedy this through risk education. We can say, "Oh no, like you're overestimating the likelihood that you're going to get eaten by a shark," and so forth. And then we might talk about how people need to acquire grit. And we think about that as a skill. So the remedy to fear is, on the one hand, cognitive, get your probabilities right. And then it's like this type of character where we think of character development as the acquisition of certain life skills. But I think you say that the only way to really address this is to think about virtues, to invoke some moral claim. In other words, to talk about how courage is something that we need to invest more in. Why is it that risk education and teaching people things like grit, why is that inadequate?
Obviously, it's better than nothing. I would rather people were exposed to any kind of intervention that helped make them aware of the fact that there is such a thing as resilience. It's part of the human conditions, that we don't always have to feel vulnerable. So I think that's better than nothing. But the problem is that the afflictions that we're discussing are not technical in nature. It's not just simply that people are learning the wrong kind of ideals. In fact, one of the problems that we have in education is that we moved away from what I call academic education towards skills education. So instead of teaching kids the love of reading, we teach them literary skills. And that goes down the line. And it seems to me that what we're then doing with kind of a skills orientation is we're depriving a lot of young people from that kind of academic challenge of essentially learning how to think abstractly and conceptually, which is really a very different way of educating and socializing young people. But I think at the end of the day, there isn't a simple answer to how you overcome this, except for the fact that it's got to involve something that brings to the fore some of these virtues, not because they're old virtues, but because things like courage have a currency in every culture. And the question becomes, do we take a courage seriously as something that's special and unique and that we need to take seriously? Or do we have what I call a California version of courage, where we talk about the courage to survive, and just by being there, you got courage. It kind of, trivialized the meaning of courage to an incredible extent. Earlier on, when we started the discussion, you used the term phronesis, practical wisdom, which I think is really, really quite important, because that kind of practical wisdom is something that provides people with a kind of sense of self, a sense of agency that people can have. And people who want to develop that sense of practical wisdom do it not by being skillful, but by seeing how they interact with the external world and what they learn from that experience, and how we sort of turn that experience into something that is both intellectually stimulating, but also is something that they can see as being integral part of who they are. It's their accomplishment. I think that kind of education is what I see as being a more effective way of going forward.
Yeah, I think it was in the book on intellectuals where you talk about how everything has become instrumental. So the reason why you want to maybe read a book is because it's good for your health or it'll help you to make money or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that horrifies me. In Oxford, I was giving a lecture on the problem of auctoritas or authority. And then one of the classicists there was explaining to the students that it's important that they listen to me because the classics are really good for your career. They really help you.
Right. Look at Boris Johnson, right?
Exactly, yeah. I kind of figured, I think there are a lot of good reasons for learning the classics, but not to get a job in the media. That's not exactly the best reason for that. But of course, I don't want to be too cynical because unfortunately, there's so much pressure in higher education to link everything to an instrumental outcome that you kind of feel that you really are going against the stream. But all that I know is that at some point, people need to value knowledge for its own sake. It's when you read a novel and you get lost in it to the point at which you don't want to finish it. You don't want to basically kind of move on because this is something that has really had an effect on you in a way that is very difficult to put in words. Those are the experiences that allow you to make those little intellectual leaps forward that are really quite important. I don't care if you want to be instrumental some of the time. Even I get instrumental sometimes on a bad day. But as long as there's a kind of exposure to ideas for its own sake, which is what universities used to be about, and that academic learning had that ethos, which we're fast losing in almost everywhere, to be honest.
Right. Well, certainly it's the case that people aren't reading books the way they used to. I think what you just described, getting lost in a novel, this may be something that our grandchildren may not ever do. I don't know. Certainly, I know in universities, we don't assign books anymore. I'm old enough to remember when I'd take a literature class and you'd have to read a novel a week, or if I took a history class and you had to read, Herodotus over the weekend. Those days seem to be long gone. Some people would say, well, so what? You're getting your content in other formats. What is it about books? Isn't this just a antiquated relic, sort of a papyrus scroll sort of thing?
I don't know. I think that books are important. Well, first of all, going through the whole sort of logic and the whole argument of a book is really quite important from beginning to the and then to see how it evolves and how it develops is really quite important. But I think books are important because it kind of demands an element of interaction between you and the author. And what happens is that sort of as you're going through the pages and reading them, it has potential to stimulate your sensibilities in a way that provides you with both an aesthetic element, but also an intellectual element. I think what is really great about a book is that it is both something that stirs the emotion, and at the same time, it makes you aware of the fact that there are problems with these ideas, these existentially difficult kind of questions, which basically means that you can, on a good day, come out a slightly different person than when you began that journey, when you kind of started on the first page. Now, I'm not against people finding other medium,
I mean, you do quite a bit of journalism yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I love journalism. I mean, journalism is great, but there's a different kind of function to it. Journalism is really good because you can react to things, you can provoke people, you can start discussion and debate. And also, for me, journalism is really good as a way of testing out my ideas. So I can arouse some ideas, see what kind of reaction I get. And that's very useful, more in a selfish kind of a way for me rather than anything else.
Yeah. The reason why I started this podcast is because I noticed that my book consumption had declined. The longer I was in academia, the fewer books I read. I was just reading articles and so forth. I felt something profoundly missing where you really spend time getting inside an argument, getting inside a person's perspective. And so it's been great for me and also I can't really skim books because I think if I'm having a conversation, you're like, yeah, you just skimmed that book. But the same is true also, I think, for lectures. I'm being told by all of the people in my administration that I need to do 3-minute video lectures instead of long form extended lectures. Is attention span something that is a product of culture? Can culture shape that? And is the shortness of attention span something related to the culture of fear? Psychology would say that if you are in a stress state, your capacity to process complex information is impaired.
Well, I think it's interesting that you raised the idea of lecture because every single medium for academic teaching that has worked in the past has now been called into question. So lectures are too long, they're too boring. Essays are too elitist, and it's unnecessary demand upon students. Seminar discussions are bad because of the pressures that are put on people. So everything that I know of, it seems to be called into question one way or the other by this very Philistine, instrumental, technologically led form of higher education. I think that there's an argument that people have put forward about people's attention span. And I argue that attention span is a metaphor. It's not something that is within us. So all these neuroscientists, they're always telling us that for various reasons, because of our brain, we can no longer concentrate as much as in the past. Or they say that because of the fact that people use iPhones and videos and various online sort of resources, it's no longer possible for people to have the same kind of concentration as before. I think that's an excuse. And the fact that what we have is not a technical problem, it's not a problem of concentration in the abstract. The problem that we have is that our culture, our society hasn't really learned to intellectually stimulate and inspire people through the great works that have been written over the centuries and all the nice stuff that's being written now. We have to remember that the number of people who are serious readers have always been a minority, just like now. So that it's not the case that, that we have less people reading them beforehand. It's just that it seems that we have less people reading because everybody's meant to read, and we have almost a universal access to higher education. Literally anybody wants a piece of paper will find a way to go to college in some shape or form. But then they come to college, and certainly in Europe, where what they do is they don't ask very much. Sometimes a few classes a week. Sometimes you can do this for years. People are told, come back and just write a few paragraphs. We now have a situation where we don't check things for plagiarism in the United Kingdom because it's just such a hassle. So we have every university's got their plagiarism check sort of kind of app that they have. But a lot of lecturers know that it basically kind of said this is an act of plagiarism. You will have to spend weeks and weeks in the court in the university fighting that case. And who wants to spend a week of their lives arguing with a student about every single word that's been plagiarized or not plagiarized? So we created this situation where we actually believe that we are not able, we got this deficit, this concentration deficit, which I think is a way of avoiding. It's a kind of Freudian displacement activity from really confronting the problems that exist.
Well, the thing that puzzles me is the kind of homogenization of all of these institutions of higher learning. You'd think that with all of the universities, we would see some kind of, segmentation or branding. So when you go to yoga, you can pick the Ashtanga, or you can pick the Hatha, you can pick the Bikram. But it seems like regardless of where you go, whether it's Oxford, Cambridge, Princeton, Harvard, Yale, they've all adopted the kind of low expectation standard and so forth. Why don't we see some kind of defecting from the pack and saying, hey, when you come here, you're still going to have to read and you're still going to have to get good grades and so forth? Why do you suppose it's so pervasive?
Well, I think universities have become industrialized to the point at which, they want to get students, they want to get funding. Their objectives, their priorities are not about academic excellence in the classical sense. They're about teaching young people how to play the game and how to look good. And I think that as a result of that, what we do have are some academics who stand out against this. And I know many academics who basically say, if you want to take my class, you're going to have to read. If you want to take my class, then I expect your willingness to be stretched and to be taken seriously. So there are people like that, but I'm always asked by people, I want to do a PhD, Frank, can you recommend somebody? Because in my university, we have people who are technicians, managers, rather than proper supervisors. So there's a big problem here. And ultimately, this problem will only be solved if we can find the money, the funding to build new universities. I think a lot of universities cannot be reformed in that kind of simple sense, because the pedagogy, we haven't talked about the higher education pedagogy that they've adopted, learning outcomes, I don't know if you got them in California, but all these silly things that people live by, the kind of ticking a box kind of approach. That cannot be reformed. You just got to get rid of all that if you're going to have the space for creative intellectual exploration.
Well, look, in your book, you talk about Philistinism, and this is a pejorative. It almost marks you out as an elitist the minute you say it. What exactly is Philistinism, and where does it come from? Is it just a product of the market? Is it just an inevitable consequence of the corrosive forces of market capitalism?
There's two sides to this: the market side, the industrialization of education side, but there's also the cultural side, and particularly the promotion of the idea of inclusion and diversity. And once education is seen as a medium for including everybody, then education changes, because what you're doing is you're not including people to the same type of education that was denied to them 20 years beforehand. Education itself changes in order to meet the needs of the newly included. And I think what the whole idea of inclusion does is it fundamentally changes the culture of academic learning, because now what becomes important is the student rather than the subject. So you have what's called student-led learning, which I think is a travesty of any kind of intellectual engagement, because in a real academic setting, you have a partnership between the academic and the students that have come in there. So I think it's both a cultural dilution of academic standards alongside the market-driven impulse. And it's the convergence of the two, which is why you have a situation where you have administrators, professional administrators, experts, kind of becoming the best allies of the inclusion diversity merchants. It's almost like they got this unholy alliance of controlling the university through their coalition.
Right. But I mean, this anti-historical movement that you talk about, I mean, isn't that led by just a new class of intellectuals? I mean, have the intellectuals gone away, or have they just been replaced with a different type of intellectual?
Well, I think there are intellectuals like, you or me, they still exist. But I don't think that, everybody with a PhD is intellectual anymore. I mean, these days, a PhD is not really very significant. I know so many people with PhDs who are, have got a clue about their own academic discipline.
Well, then what makes you an intellectual?
I think what makes an intellectual is, on the one hand, you have an academic understanding, expertise about a subject. But because you don't just stop there, you're not just an academic, but you also do, is you try to ensure that that kind of intellectual legacy that you're benefiting from is made to work for the rest of society. You engage with the public. You try to live according to those ideals, and whether it's in politics or in some cultural institutions, you try to play a role as a citizen. I think that those two aspects are really what marks you out. Not every academic needs to become an intellectual. I wouldn't mind if there were more academics that were, the old classical 18th century German academics just sitting in their rooms and writing great books. I wouldn't mind that. They don't have to become intellectuals or be in public. But at the moment, we have neither serious academics in the classical sense nor intellectuals in the modern sense, sort of playing an active role. There are some, but they are conspicuous by their few numbers.
Well, if we circle back to the discussion on history, I mean, is this attack on history or attack on the past? I mean, it seems like this is something which pervades the culture, but it's also inside of the academic profession of history. I mean, are the historians themselves to blame for this? I mean, is it that the trends that happen within academic history then get pushed out to the culture, or is it that the culture is sort of shaping what academic historians are doing? I mean, I love, you quote Hobsbawm, you quote Lucien Febvre, who they both said that anachronism is the worst offense that a historian can engage in. I'm guessing that it's been a long time since I did my PhD work in history. But, when we did our core training in history, we went back and we started with, Gilgamesh and worked our way up to Roll, Jordan, Roll. I mean, we were told this. I'm guessing that first-year historians are not told this. Is the culture driving the academic norms, or is it the other way around?
Very difficult to disentangle that. I think it's a dialectical relationship in the sense that you have a cultural demand for eroding temporal distinctions between the past and the present and the future. That's a cultural dynamic at the moment. And we have academics, particularly academics who are influenced by identity politics, who regard that it's their job to basically celebrate anachronism. And for them, the art of reading history backwards is not seen as a kind of empty exercise, but it's seen as a creative way of changing the past. So they actually think that the past can be changed. And that kind of temporal confusion that they imbibe plays a very important role, because then they provide the books which become circulated in culture and in the media. It's a kind of dialectical relationship between the two. But in the long run, I think what I worry about is not a historian who's a bit of a slob, and instead of actually examining the 18th century sort of rigorously and forensically, and just merely discovers what he wants to see, history is not the big problem. I'm much more worried about a culture that we have created where that kind of temporal confusion is something that's on the agenda and is promoted in all kinds of different ways.
Well, I mean, you pointed out that ever since the founding of America, America has always been trying to slough off the past. And that probably led to some really wonderful things. And so at what point does that desire to put the past behind you turn into something pathological? You talk about this frenetic standstill. It seems like there's been elements of that in American culture since day one.
Yeah, there's a difference between saying, well, history begins with the New World, but still having a very strong sense of, the founding fathers were immersed in historical consciousness, but they wanted to create something new. So there's nothing really wrong about that. In fact, it's quite a positive thing that people want to create a new world in different kinds of ways. But there's a difference between saying that the past is left behind or it's not that relevant anymore. Although I would dispute that, and to say that the past is toxic and hurts us and we should have no respect for it. Because you can argue that the past sort of is no longer relevant and still have a lot of respect for what humanity has achieved over the centuries. That can still be the case, as opposed to now where you lose that respect and you regard those people in the past as your morally inferiors.
Well, I learned one thing recently in your writing, which I can't believe I didn't know, which is the word religion means to tie yourself back. I didn't know that. I studied Latin for years and it didn't occur to me. And so without running the risk of being instrumental, why is it that we need to teach people, particularly young people, about the past? I think you could say that it's worthy of study for its own sake, of course, but I think you're also going to make the claim that it does something to provide people with the capacity for some kind of virtue. What is it that is enabled by a deep and complex understanding of one's past?
I think what happens is it teaches you to know where you come from, and knowing where you come from, knowing the fact that you're connected with other human beings is really quite important for giving you a sense of self. And ultimately, people's identity, it depends upon having that kind of connection. If you don't have that, then you end up having a permanent identity crisis in the way that we have now, where people are always looking for different kinds of identity, whether it's in fashion or whatever. It's going from one thing to the next because there isn't that kind of understanding of who they are and where they come from, which I think is really quite important. And it's not that you want young people to subordinate themselves to the past or to imagine that the past is better than what they can create, but they have to have a sense of connection with the achievements of humanity. If not, then we end up having a very dehumanized kind of culture as a result of that.
Well, Frank, thanks so much for joining me. There's a lot of books. The latest one, of course, is called The War Against the Past: Why the West Must Fight for Its History. Thanks for joining me.
Pleasure talking to you. I really enjoyed that.
Thank you for tuning in to the unSILOed podcast produced by University FM. If you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a 5-star rating and review in your favorite listening app. To listen to our other episodes, please visit our website at www.unsiloedpodcast.com.